I want this tutorial to be a bit of a textbook for my Redshift lighting workflow. I have done numerous of these kind of tutorials within Octane, and it's pretty similar in Redshift. So this is definitely a beginner tutorial for people that are still find lighting a little bit vague and kind of want to know a decent path forward on how to light things and how I think about lighting. We're going to cover all of that today. So it's going to be a bit more simple and a bit more straightforward and a bit more beginner orientated. As usual, the first 5 people that hit the link at the top of the description will get my Patreon for free for a month. And if you happen to miss that, but don't worry if you happen to miss that, there will be a link below that. If you use the code LIGHTING for the first couple of hours after this tutorial goes live, you'll get my Patreon for 50% off. We're going to be using this Air Max model to do some lighting on. But what I want you to think about with this is a lot of people that are new to lighting can kind of get caught up in all the different factors that play into lighting. Your materials, your scene, the amount of things in the scene. Assuming what makes this a beginner's tutorial is the fact that we're going to keep it simple, of course, but also the fact that we're doing this in a relatively simple scene. The only really adjacent corruption to our lighting in this scene is going to be our materials, and they're really simple. The materials that you get with the model are basically hooked up the way they're supposed to be, and the material sort of creates itself. There's not much complexity going on there. So what I want to do before we do any lighting on these shoes is just take you through a little bit of a simple lighting setup to ensure that you kind of understand the mechanisms of this workflow. So what we're going to do in this scene is we're going to make a plane, and don't worry, we'll get to lighting the shoes soon, but if you are super new to lighting and really want to improve your lighting, I want you to follow along with this part. The tutorial will, of course, have chapters, so if you don't care for this, you can skip through it. Let's make this plane something like 2000 by 2000, right? And what we're going to do is just hold shift and hit here and grab a bend deformer. And you can set this to 90 degrees and hit fit to parent. I believe that should be right. We may have to give it some size on the Y in the middle there. And if we bend this 90 degrees that way, and then let me figure this out, bend it 90 degrees this way, and then we can just drop that down. We're probably going to want to reduce the size here. As you reduce that size, it's going to tighten this up. So you can see what we've got is this big plane. We can increase the segments here as well, which will help a little bit with it. And if we drag that down, we'll tighten that up. So now we've kind of got this backdrop, right? And we're just making a really simple scene here. We can make that maybe a little bit wider. What we're going to do next is drop in a sphere. And we're just going to pull that up. And we'll make it about 120. And I'm going to turn off my work plane, and we can just go straight into Redshift from here. So let's drop in the render view and get that going. And the first thing we're going to do is just drop in a camera. And this is just a really simple scene setup. We'll set this to 200, and then we're going to zero everything out but the Z axis. So we're looking straight on here. We can just bring that up, and we can come back a little bit. Now, why have I made you make this scene with just a ball in a background? Maybe increase the size of the height here as well, actually, just so we're covered, you know? Why have I made you make this scene? Might be worth also dropping that in a subdivision surface. You can set that to 1. So yeah, the reason I've wanted you to make this scene is because if you cannot light a sphere on a simple background, how do you expect to light anything else? And I feel like through people that I've coached and a lot of lighting that I've looked at and had to correct for people, usually it's a little bit too overcomplicated. So what we're going to do in this scene is make some cool lighting with 0 materials, 0 complexity, and see that we can get a clean render just with a couple of lights. So let's drop in a area light. And one thing when you're lighting is target the object. The reason I tell everybody to target the object is because then you don't have to rotate the light. You can just move it and it's going to follow, which is amazing. Now, if we just push this light, what we can do here as well is press F2 and then go to cameras and perspective and then do NA on the keyboard to get back to garage shading. Turn off the work plane again. If we just set this light off to the right here, and we go to this sphere and we turn up the segments to 100, just so it's got super clean geometry, and I'm going to up my resolution here. All we've needed to get a pretty okay render is nothing. One light in the scene. And I would have a look at asking yourself, if you were making a render like this, would have you made this more complicated than you should have? Now, another thing as well is we would want to be able to control the shadows here. And this is where lighting is kind of broken down, is we have the light, but the light isn't controlling the darkness or the lightness of the shadows. That's separated from the light. So how do we control that? Well, in Redshift, we can drop in something called a dome light. And in this dome light, in this color here, we can control our shadows. So you can see here, when I make this white, we've got these nice white soft shadows. When I make this dark, we've got dark shadows. Now, because we've already got our background covered here, we don't have to worry about that affecting our background. But you could think of this dome light as your shadows. And you could think of this area light as well. Light_01. I would maybe darken that and put it somewhere in the middle. And then we could add a second light. Push it off to the back a little bit. And we would want a slight highlight around the edges there. But we wouldn't want this light affecting this backdrop. That's what's interesting about using backdrops. If we go into that light and go to project, what we can do is just exclude this geometry. And now this light is affecting the ball, but it's not affecting the background, and it's not affecting this shadow. We can turn down the power of this light to something like 50. And we can now get a nice highlight on the ball. And we could maybe increase our shadows a little bit too. And we have a pretty clean render, a nice studio render. And with this, we're exercising nearly everything you would have to do to light most scenes and make them look really, really good. We're excluding an object and understanding that one light is pushing most of the scene while another light is just adding a little highlight, which is entirely subjective whether you would want it or not. No matter how large your scene gets, no matter how complex of a scene you're working on, this is really as complex as it potentially needs to be for the most part. But there's one more thing that can interfere with your lighting workflow. And in this render specifically, we've eliminated materials. But the last thing would be your camera, your optics, your color correction. All of this can take your lighting from being blown out or over the top. And there is the argument that if your lights are correct, then you wouldn't need that. And that is the case in this scenario. But I would still usually apply some of that. The first thing I like to touch is vignetting. And you usually have to really overcrank it in Redshift to get it to do anything. But the reason I like some vignetting is not only does it sort of darken the edges of your scene, but it actually adds as a bit of highlight compression. So it sort of just makes everything a bit more even in your image. And in just about every render ever, I have some sort of vignetting on, even just enough that it's not visible, but it's enough that it's bringing down the blowouts of the lights. So whether I'm in Octane or whether I'm in Redshift, I'm nearly always using vignetting. The other thing would be in color correction. If we were to enable tone mapping, we can then make our highlights pop more or bring them back. You know, with something like this, we kind of want it somewhere in the middle. We don't want it, even at the top there in this scene, it looks fine, but somewhere in the middle, we just kind of want this nice, cohesive, even scene. Saturation and colors aren't really applied here either, which again is going to make it easier for us to learn some lighting. And if you've watched any of my other tutorials, you'll understand that I like to use LUTs a lot, and I like to use color controls. So I would nearly always add in a LUT, and I would usually apply color management before the LUT, and in Redshift I tend to drop the strength of them a bit more. The other thing in Redshift I tend to do is add some color controls and just pull a bit of contrast out of the image here. It's not, again, not as visible in this scene. But you can see here we've got a super clean render, and just to enable that post effects on and off, you can just see that that post effects just dials everything in a little bit more. That's all I wanted to show you with this scene. Just a little simple lighting setup. If you struggle with this, then I would play with this until you can get this looking clean. But now we've got that out of the way, let's go back to the Air Max model. So now if you followed along with that, hopefully that's set the precedent for what we're going to do, because we're basically going to do the same thing. but now it doesn't seem as scary. So let's do the same thing. Let's add in that camera. Let's set it to 150. Zero out everything here. Now, why is it important that we zero out the camera? Why is it important? I do all this stuff in my tutorials all the time and I want to break it down. Why is it important that these are all at 0, the rotation's at 0, the only parameter that has any value is the Z? Well, that's important because the objects should also be at the center of the scene. Now, what this does, and I see this a lot when I'm coaching people, is the shoes will be off here and the camera will be looking at them like this, and they're trying to get some sort of front angle, but that really messes with your tempo. I mean, sure, if it works, but what you're essentially doing when you're doing things like that is throwing sticks in front of your feet, and you're going to make yourself trip up. And as your scenes get more complex, it's just going to be difficult to do really simple things. If everything is, setting up this F2 view again, if everything is completely structured, let me just also turn off my materials. If everything is completely zoned in here, and you know that when you drop in a light, it's going to come in at the center of your scene. If you want to add more objects to your scene, a cube, it comes in there. Working like this is always much more effective. With our render on the go, let's do the same thing. Now, I have these Redshift render tags on there, and we have some tessellation to make sure they're subdivided. This is something I would also recommend you doing, is subdividing in the render tag. Let's drop in an area light. Now, we've got two shoes here, and they're kind of spread out a little bit, right? So what we probably want to do is add a null dead at the center of the scene, and then add that target and target the null. And we do the same thing. We push this light off to the right, and this is a good starting point. But before we go too deep into the lighting, we can call that target. Call this light _1. Before we go too deep into the lighting, I want to come back to this dome light that we used. So what I tend to do in scenes that specifically have reflectivity in any kind of way, even not so much with reflectivity, but especially scenes with reflectivity, is I like to add a HDRI. And this is an extremely underrated way of lighting, because what we're going to do with this HDRI is use it to fill in the gaps and to forfeit some of the control of lighting to the HDRI to make our lives easier. And I'll explain that more in a second. So you can drop in any random studio HDRI. I would probably use a studio HDRI in most cases. Even in more realistic scenes, I think the only times I tend not to do it is if I'm lighting a car or something and I want sort of real world reflections in the car. But even then, most of the time I use a HDRI like this. Let's increase the intensity of it. And we've got this rotate on horizon, but you can see it's affecting the background. We don't want it to affect the background. So what we're going to do, we're going to drop in another Redshift dome light, and we're going to make this black. But in the details, we're going to change all of these to 0, just like that. And back in the other dome light, we just want to turn off the background. Now, why have I done that? Why have I added the second dome light when you can just disable the background here? Well, again, it's just for separation. This is a background object. This is a light. To me, it just makes it cleaner in my head. Yes, you could just disable that, but to me, it just makes it a little bit more neat in my head to understand that this would be background and this would be HDRI. It's probably because I used Octane for such a long time and I still do, I still use both, but in Octane, you have to do this. So there's kind of my workflow bleeding over there with that a little bit, but just know that you can just hit disable there, really. What was my main point before about using this to fill in the gaps and forfeit control? Well, what I believe with lighting is that if you're obsessed over every highlight and you're obsessed over every placement and every single tiny little thing, you're going to make your life more difficult. And if you drop in a HDRI and you just sort of spin it about and find something like this that just highlights an edge, add some nice reflections, it's just a nice filling point. I'm going to turn these off in the viewport as well. And then we come back to that light now. And we come back to this view. And also we want to change Redshift to that camera. let's just set up a couple of different lights. Now, what would I do with the lights here? I don't like to use too many lights, really, ever. It's rare I go above 3. Depends on the scene I'm working in, especially with renders like this, though. I don't think you need too many, and I always try to tell people keep it simple. So we've got one light. I don't want this to be too crazy, so let's kind of push it around the back a little bit, and then let's duplicate this. Let's do another one on this side. Fill in a couple of parts. Again, I want this lighting to be kind of spaced out. Now we only really have this gap here on the front of darkness. Could the HDRI fix that? That's something I want people to look at. Is by spinning that HDRI around now, we've filled in that gap and we don't need an extra light. Would I probably use an extra light? I would also probably look at that as well. So if we were to reverse that and then bring in one more light around the front, make it smaller. And you can also mess with the spread of these lights. So if we were to come back to the first light and have a little look at the spread here, you can see here as we change this spread value, this is really nice in Redshift, we can just sort of make the light behave a bit differently. Looks a little bit ugly all the way down, and I think sometimes the spread can behave a little bit better with the light shaped like a disc, but it's a value to mess with. Enable that second light, see what the spread's doing. We'll come back to that third light. We want this light smaller, maybe around the front. That would be a difficult decision for me, whether I would want that light there or the HDRI. But I think it's important to have in your arsenal and to know what to do and to understand that the HDRI can fill this in for us. We can just keep over cranking that until we find that highlight like we found before, just kind of around here. And then we would kind of be at the point we were at before. The lighting is in an okay place, and you could maybe potentially want to mess with more lights and thinking your lighting's not there, when really what we kind of need to do now is just mess with the optics, mess with the camera. So, for example, let's add in a LUT. The link to these LUTs is below my Prime tutorial, so if you want to get them, go and check out that tutorial. Apply color management before LUT. Just with this LUT, we have went from an extremely grey render, see here, to a render that pops a lot. So LUTs are something you want to really, really leverage in your render. Come to the color correction. Let's pull that down a bit. Pull this up a little bit. I would maybe have this render pop a little bit more. And then again, the vignetting, like I said before. As you can see, we can just use that to just dial in the edges. The color correction, again, with the highlights, we don't want it too blown out. But now you can see that the lighting's good, but we can see the holes in the lighting, we can see the flaws. What would we want to do to this lighting to improve everything? Well, I would say we probably want more highlights potentially around the top. And again, we kind of want to fill in more of this central part of the model. But now we're in a better spot to play with that because we have more vibrant, more effective contrast levels. The entire scene just is flowing now, and we can mess with these lights and see if we can find something now that fills this in. So you can see now what I can do is sort of make this light do a couple of jobs at once and affect this shoe as well as the back shoe. You could maybe pull this light or make it longer to affect more of the back. Just also checking the distance here of the lights. And then let's again come back to this third light. So again, I don't want this light to fill everything in because I like the punchiness of the render. I like that we have those shadows. But I would want this light to just act as a bit of a fill. And of course, what we've got to remember is we moved that HDRI, so that HDRI is filling a lot of stuff in. If we were to turn off all the lights, sorry for the back and forth, this is what happens when you're recording a lighting tutorial for the most part. I really like the HDRI filling in most of the background of the model and adding a highlight to nearly all of it. And then at that point, if we say that in our minds, okay, the HDRI is filling in the edges, we can just use our lights to fill in the central parts of the model. I would maybe increase the spread of this front one. It's not often I like things from the front, but maybe increase the spread and drop the strength and keep tweaking that until I find a nice point with it. Maybe a little bit more underneath. And something like that I feel like I would be relatively happy with. The HDRI though, those highlights can add a little bit too much of a disconnection sometimes at the same time. So I kind of wouldn't go too crazy on the strength with that. You know, if we drop that to 0, you can see I would just round about there probably. Round about 0.2 is probably enough for what I would want. But there's one last thing I would do to this scene, and that would be to add a plane, set it to +Z, move it back, and this would be our background. And again, this is the importance of having the camera at the center of the scene and having everything structured around that. If we were to add a Redshift material and add a environment and put that on the plane, and we come into the material here, let's add a ramp, and let's put this ramp into the surface and set it to circular. And let's have a kind of lightest gray with a darker gray, or a lighter gray in the middle going to a darker gray on the edges. So you really kind of have to have quite low values here. Let's try something like 4%. Black on the edges. I don't know if that's the right way around actually. Let's see here. Let's dial these in and see. Yeah, so we've got the dark in the middle right now. Let's flip them. Again, we don't really want too much of that contrast between the two, too much of that separation. Some sort of spot highlight behind it. You have to remember the vignetting is going to play into that. So we see that the vignetting has a lot of control over this right now. And that's something to remember, because you can be sitting there messing with the ramp and messing with it and thinking, why isn't it changing? And well, it's your vignetting that's controlling most of that. But what I would really want to hear is just a little bit dimension in the background, so there's just sort of a slight light behind it. That's our lighting pretty much done. I feel like the models are in a good point. I would maybe push them up a tad. In this tutorial, I didn't really want to master the lighting. I didn't really want to make sure that everything was pitch perfect and this reflection and that reflection. And I feel like it's more effective and going to help you in the long term that I teach you a system for lighting rather than saying, this is a render, this is how you can make this render. No, it's like, no, work like this every time, do this every time, build the blocks from there upon this, target your lights, control your shadows, understand what's controlling your shadows. Of course, in this scenario now, the HDRI is controlling our shadows. We don't have direct control over that now. It's the HDRI. Understanding when your optics, your camera imager, your curves come into things, and build on that. Keep it simple. Don't go adding 5, 6, 7, 8 lights into your scene. People always ask me, what are my render settings? And it's like, your render settings don't really matter. They really don't. They're not really going to affect your render except in very, very niche cases. Your render settings 90% of the time should be pretty much the same thing. If you've got tons of noise in your scene, you're creating that noise. So it's nearly impossible to have a noisy render with one light in the scene, because noise typically comes from different lights interfering with each other and they don't really know what's going on. So of course materials play into it, and different materials can cause more noise and whatnot, but in most cases, when I see a noisy render with people, they have about triple the amount of lights as this, and they have tons of little lights everywhere, and they're trying to dial in the reflections. If you just forfeit all of that to the HDRI, and then just concentrate intentionally in a couple of lights and kind of understanding what they do and what their place is, we can get a good render really, really quickly. Kind of want to push that light a bit farther away. And in this render, for example, I don't know how much I like how dark this is at the front here. It sort of fades to black a bit too much and whatnot. I would sit here playing with this for a long, long time. And if I just sort of give you the system and give you the code, then we can move on. I'm going to show you one more scene quickly. And we're going to put these shoes in a cloner, and then we'll move on from there. And you can see here as well, if you compare this to my original renders, that of course I'd spent a lot more time, more than 20 minutes making. I had a couple of renders here, one which is kind of a more dialed in spread and fall off of the light that's highlighting this part of the shoe. That's not a gobo or anything, that's just the spread, really dialing in this part of the shoe. And then I've got this other one that's more similar to what we've got now. A little bit more commonality in the reflections though, and a little bit more balanced. Again, that just comes from just spending a bit more time in the render. But what's important here about from building this system of the light is if I was to show you this render at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and then this render at 7 o'clock at night the same day, you would probably say, yeah, that's the same image you showed me earlier. And that's, again, my main point about forfeiting some control and just letting it all kind of flow in. This is my lighting workflow. This is what I've built up, and I really try to think about, how I'm doing these things, especially as I'm making tutorials and teaching other people how to make these renders. I was going to move straight on to lighting a scene with a cloner, but what I actually want to do is just actually quickly take you to the final touches of this render. I wasn't going to do that, but now I am going to do it, because just after kind of comparing those two images there, I thought, you know what, we're a couple of movements away from having the render look that good, although I don't want to go too deep worrying about reflections and pinpointing things, because that's not what I'm trying to teach here. I'm more just trying to teach the workflow, but I do just want to take this to a little bit more of a final spot. So realistically, what I would do to get that, just kind of looking at the old images, is I would maybe push this a little bit further back here. And it's been a couple of seconds since I made any changes, so we just need to wait on that. Just push this light a little bit more underneath the shoe, just so you can see this here at the angle, or just a little bit further behind the shoe. And I would actually bring the spread kind of back up, because when that spreads down, it's going to hit much more of a targeted area. I just want that spread a little bit further up. It's good for some uses, but not all the time. So we're going to kind of bring that around there. And then with this light, I'm going to drop the power as well. And this is important really just for my render with what I'm doing with these shoes, just to kind of get some of the texture patterns and get it similar to what we were working with before. I'm going to keep lowering that, keep lowering it. You can see here what that light's doing is we're actually getting a lot of reflections from the HDRI, but that's not really to worry about right now, because we're going to move the HDRI in a second. I'm going to say somewhere around 40. And then on this light, I may do the same thing. Just bring down the power a bit again. And I'm going to budge that slightly over. And then in the HDRI, let's rotate that on the horizon over again. I want to get those highlights on the edges. So we're going to keep rotating that around until we see those highlights like we saw earlier. So you may have to push this over and drag it in the box. I don't think I had to do that the first time actually. Just keep spinning it about. Let's bring up the power as well, actually, that'll help a lot. And turn off the lights. And we can just see exactly where we're hitting. Okay, yeah, so about here, about 150-ish, I really want to highlight these shiny parts of the shoe. Turn back on the lights. And I'm going to bring it up a little bit more. I really want to get the highlights on more close to the top. Right there. More close to the top. And we need, we come back to F1. One of you guys made a comment in one of my other Redshift tutorials that avoids this from happening because I'm so used to doing it the Octane way when I'm in this F2 view. The camera imager doesn't get applied until you press F1. I believe this goes back if we change it to the Redshift camera here. And then even when we go back and forth, we still retain the benefits of the camera imager, which of course helps a lot. I'm just going to bring up the power of the HDRI a tad bit more. And then let's come back to our contrast levels and just sort of make that a bit more over the top. And I'd say this is closer to something I would be looking at for final render. So I just wanted to make a couple of those changes over a few minutes and just sort of show you what I would edge towards if I was to finalize that a bit more. Again, I would play with this more, and there is other things I would pay attention to. But the fact right now is, if you're not somebody that it's common for you to get many results out of this quality, then I want you to work on this workflow and understand how easy it can be. Anyway, moving on now, what I want to do is do some similar lighting, but with the shoe in a cloner. Changes things up a little bit, how we have the light, and I just think it would be worth showing. So what I'm going to do is do this in the same scene, but I've saved it incrementally, and then I'm just going to make a couple of changes, just so we've kind of got everything still set up. What we can do, just for this second, is turn off our lights, and let's turn off the left shoe. But with that main shoe, I'm going to have to zero everything out, so it's perfectly sat in the middle of everything, and then we're just going to drop that shoe in a cloner, and we'll change it to multi-instance, and then change it to radial, and then we'll change it to XY, and we'll put the count to say 6, keep it an even number, and we can bring up the radius a little bit, and then come to the transform, and we can transform the shoe however we want it, whether it would look better, all of them sort of coming into the middle like this, or the other way around. I don't know, we will find that out in a second. What I like to do with the cloner is often have something a bit like that, where they're sort of overlapping, and then we can pull that camera back. But of course we'll have to change the size of the plane. That's easy enough to do. And I don't think I want 2 in the middle. I think I want more of a sort of circular shape like this. And let's turn back on the lights just for a second. And that small light, we won't need that. Let's press F2. Just quickly shove one light to the side here. But we want to push these around the front a little bit. And then do the same thing here. Make it way bigger though. That's the kind of vital part here. And you would have seen me mention in tutorials before as well, that if you're not aware of this, the bigger your light, the softer your shadows. The smaller your light, the harder the shadows, but you need to compensate by putting up the power of the light. So of course when the light's bigger, you can afford to have a lower intensity because there's more surface area of the light, which in tandem puts up the power of the light. So when you're making lights bigger, remember that will make your lights more powerful. And you should have to compensate with the distance of your light from your object. What I usually like to do with something like this is have one light a little bit higher and one light a little bit lower. And I feel like this often covers things. But back to the cloner though. On my old cloner render, I believe I had these a little bit more sideways. Something a bit more like that. And I think it may have had one in the middle. So I'm just going to edge closer to that. And line tick wise on this, what I want more of is more of an edge light. So we'll see what we can do with that with the HDRI. One thing I would think about in this scene a little bit more, I really should have mentioned this before with the HDRI, is this plane. We probably want the HDRI to ignore the plane because this will be blocking some light coming from the HDRI because it's so close to the object. There's something I should have mentioned before. It's even more important, I would say, in this setup. And we're going to get a bit more light passing off of the HDRI now because of that. So we can rotate that about. I want more highlights. Maybe something like that. Turning back on the lights now. Not a whole lot we have to do really. We kind of did most of the setup before. So all we're really doing here is slightly bigger lights. Again, I'm going to try and push things to the back a little bit. I don't know how much I want. For example, in this shoe, that kind of blast of light. A little bit more on the sides of things, but then we're at that point we can have to worry about the middle shoes not getting enough light. I think a little bit more distance. And maybe we can match the way these lights sit. And you get a pretty clean render from that just by changing a couple of things. And now here we have something cool going on. But what I want to do is sort of push this in a slightly different direction. So we've used the setup that we've had. We've leveraged off of that and still made a pretty clean render. Just not really took too much changing. I don't think we really need a third light here. But what I want to do is just sort of spin the art direction on this. So temporarily I'm going to turn off the HDRI. And in this scene, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of the lights and I'm going to push it above the shoes here and kind of get this top light. So what I'm really doing here is just showing you a little bit of a different direction. And let's drop the spread this time on this big light. I don't know if I'm going to keep it at the top, but we drop the power with that spread. So you think, we drop that spread, that then pushes all the power of the light into one place. Let's compensate by dropping the intensity. And you can just do that incrementally. Let's maybe put it above. See what it looks like in the middle. Something like that is quite nice. See what it looks like at the bottom. I think something middle to top, but then at the same time we get really nice even spread across the edges there. So we can keep it in the middle for a second. And then with the second light, let's push this behind. Now we've highlighted everything. And then if we come back to that HDRI, turns off the light a second, I'm going to get rid of that third light. Now, instead of the HDRI being a backlight, let's use that to push reflections and highlight spots, just like that, all over the object. I do remember up around 150, kind of looking good as well. Maybe something like this. Turn the lights back on. I would say that's a pretty sick setup. That backlight you could, because we're working in a circular shape, you could make that a disc, and then you could bring the sizes of that up. So we're sort of, as these edges that are fading to black, we're sort of covering those a little bit more, but I would also drop the power. Because highlights can have a tendency to be a bit sharp and be a bit jittery. And I think that sometimes if you just lower the power on those highlights, make them a little bit more subtle, you're still getting that pop, but you're not really noticing it so much. And you can see that sometimes with highlights, they can get a bit harsh. If we come back to this front view, we can sort of see what's a better angle here. Push the circle out where it needs to be. And you can also see now that this light could probably be more centered like that, if you really want to get perfect with all the specifics. Clock the camera out a bit more, increase the size of that plane, and now we have more of a cloner setup. And this is kind of what I wanted to do, is just show you a little bit of a different setup with the lights. I don't really want to just make a cloner and have the lights in similar positions. I want to show you more of something that suits what we've got, while thinking about it and sort of thinking about the objects, the setup, and then saying, okay, how do we make the lights fit that and suit that in the best way possible? But again, the main point here is we have a very filled scene in terms of lighting. There's lots going on. There's nothing that really feels left out. And this is just from 2 lights in the scene in a HDRI. A good resource for HDRIs is the Grayscale Gorilla HDRIs. They've got tons of amazing studio HDRIs in there. And the HDRI I'm using, it's just covering a lot of light. And that's where this is useful here. It's one that if you use a HDRI that has a lot of spotlights and has a lot of small pieces of light, that might not work so well. When I use these HDRIs, I tend to use ones that have more long strips of lights using the studio HDRIs. And I think the more you aim for those, the more benefits you're going to get. I think that's the main takeaway of this tutorial, is using as little lights as possible to achieve max results. This is going to reduce noise and make your renders look cleaner and make them look more professional, supplementing that with HDRIs. Again, HDRIs are never ever going to cause any noise. There's been a couple of scenarios I've had to use HDRIs on last minute notice to kick renders out and just only light with the HDRI, because the HDRI causes zero noise. So I want you to think about that as you're making renders, whether it's Octane, Redshift, using as little lights as possible. How do you supplement that? And then making sure your optics, your camera imager, and all of that is set up for the cleanest render possible. Making sure it's balanced, making sure everything is coherent. There's no parts of it that are overly popping out. I mean, you could say that about mine here, but that's not the end of the world. I think you get the point. Spending time dialing all this in. Could maybe drop the highlights a little bit more there to try and reduce that, or reducing the LUT strength. There's a lot we could play with, but I hope you've learned a lot. I hope you've managed to pick up some parts of my workflow, keeping things minimal, understanding what you're putting things in for. If you're going to keep endlessly adding lights, you're going to have to pay for that. You're going to have a noisy render. It's also just going to make everything more difficult. We really don't have to do a lot here. There's a couple of little tricks like having the HDRI ignore the plane, something I should have done earlier in the tutorial, but you get the point. Really hope you've picked up a lot from this. I like doing these beginner tutorials. It's nice to sort of explain sometimes some basic stuff that can feel almost too basic to actually make a tutorial on. So I appreciate it when you guys comment and say that you want more beginners tutorials, because where my head goes most of the time when it comes to making tutorials is to go for the next best thing and the biggest complex thing. So I hope you guys appreciate this one. Like I said, the model will be linked in the description if you do want to go get that. And like I mentioned as well, the materials sort of build themselves and make it really, really simple. And like I said, the material pretty much builds itself. There is only a couple of materials you need here. And as you open up, I believe it came in a Cinema 4D project file, so it was easy enough to convert these to Redshift and then just hook up everything that needed hooked up properly. I believe the one thing I struggled with it was making sure this opacity map on the air bubbles here was correct. I still don't know if it entirely is, to be honest. I think it's a bit more translucent on the real shoe. Hope you enjoyed this. Like I said, first 5 people to hit that link in the description below will get my Patreon for free for a month. There will also be another link, and if you use the code lighting, you get my Patreon 50% off for the next few hours after this tutorial goes live. God knows how long I'll leave it live for. So if you're watching this tutorial 12 hours later, have a look. Might still be up there. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned a lot. Merry Christmas. And I'll see you in the next tutorial. My Patreon is a place where I can make tutorials that are a lot more in-depth than YouTube. Things that don't always suit the YouTube algorithm. Breaking down all the different parts of my workflow, how I light things, how I apply materials to things, and the various different parts of my workflow, looking at client work, looking at breakdowns, looking at my scenes in general, and often doing a lot of repetitive tutorials over and over to really build up that workflow so we can get good at 3D. So sign up to my Patreon today and see exactly what my true 3D workflow is all about.